right, good evening, everyone. We're going to get started, and glad that you can be here today. This is part of our Shomrei Adama program at Temple Emanu-El. Shomrei Adama are guardians of the earth, and for the past couple of months, we've been focusing on a different commitment, a different thing that we will be signing up for to help our earth, help the planet that we live on. I spoke about this on Friday night, connecting a little bit to the silver linings of COVID-19, as well as the Torah portion of Bachar Bechota and the first environmental ethics code. And how we can do, what we've learned is that even our own actions, even if they're small, can make a big difference. And if we collectively do it, we have over 100 people signed up with this initiative, we can make changes in this world. And they might not be huge, massive changes, but they could affect our climate, our communities, and our livelihoods. And so we're focusing on water conservation. The Tikkun Olam Committee, in a week or two, starting in June, we're going to be focusing on composting. And if you are not a part of the Shomrei Adama initiative, we invite you to sign up. But now I'm going to turn it over to Elaine Morgenthau. Elaine Morgenthau is the Vice President of Social Justice and Religious Living at Temple Emanu-El. She has been a wonderful partner and a great person to bring these programs to us. So I'm going to turn it over to her, who will introduce our speaker for our evening.
Thank you, Rabbi. So we're so excited to have our speaker and to listen to this presentation. Mary Kornfeld is from Stand With Us. She is the Executive Director of High School Affairs, and she's been with Stand With Us for almost 9 years. She's from Denver, graduated from UCLA, and started working with Stand With Us right after she graduated. She's moved to New York 4.5 years ago and has continued to work in this very important program. If you remember, we had somebody from Stand With Us join us before for BDS, so this is another wonderful program that they are doing. Mary got her master's in Jewish education at Hebrew University, and we're just so excited to have her join us and talk about water. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you so much, Elaine. Thank you so much, Rabbi. And thank you so much to everybody who's taking the time to sit on Zoom. It's a gorgeous day outside. I was able to be outside for a little bit today. I'm currently in New York City, the epicenter of it all. So don't worry, I'm being careful over here, but I'm very, very excited to be part of this program with you all and speaking about something that is particularly important to my heart, special to my heart. As Elaine said, I'm originally from Denver, which means that I love any and all things environmental and recycling. So this is something that definitely speaks to my heart, and it brings in my favorite country in the world, which is Israel. So to give you guys a brief introduction about Stand With Us and the work that we do. Stand With Us is an international Israel education organization, and we work with communities all around the world so that they have the tools that they need to have good conversations about Israel, to be educated about Israel, you know, not just talking points, but kind of deep, nuanced information, so that you can really have those fantastic conversations. I head up our North American high school department for Stand With Us, which means that I work with all of my staff around North America to teach high school students about Israel, to prepare high school students for what they might face with regards to Israel on their future college campuses, and then to just be that first touch point that many high school students have to Israel, which is very exciting. So definitely one of the things that we speak to our high school students about a lot is the issue of water in Israel, not only because it is such a hot topic, but because it's interesting. So I'm really excited to be able to share that here with you guys today. I want to kind of zoom out and start with some broader context, because as we all know, as the world continues to move forward, we are using more and more water. We're thinking that potentially in the next 10 years, the water demand is going to increase by maybe about 40%. And that 2025, actually 2/3 of the world are going to live in conditions of water scarcity. that issue is zoomed in even more in the Middle East, where we know that there's issues of water scarcity already. And that's why we're going to talk a little bit about that today. So before we jump into water itself, let's just give the broader context of looking into Israel's history. I'm sure that many of you know the basics, so we're going to spend very little time on this. But the story of Israel, as we all know, it's an inspiring story. It's a story of rebirth. It's a story of resilience. It's a story of empowerment and really hope. It's a story of indigenous people overcoming millennia of oppression to reclaim their freedom in their ancestral homeland, and that's Israel. The Jewish people's roots are in Israel. There's been an unbroken Jewish presence in the land of Israel for thousands of years, except for during the time of the diaspora, where few did remain inside of the land, but that is the time when many Jews were living outside of the land of Israel and were vulnerable. They were persecuted very badly, as we know about. And Zionism, modern day Zionism, began in the 19th century, and it was a response to that oppression that the Jewish people were facing. It developed into a liberation movement and ultimately the establishment of the state of Israel. So water was and remains a challenge, and that's one of the factors in Israel's development that we're going to kind of dive deeper into today. So most Israelis it's been drilled into their brains since day zero, this concept of chaval al kol tipa, that loosely translated means every drop counts. And that's really how it is with Israelis. Whenever I'm talking to Israelis about how I love a warm shower at the end of a long hike or whatever, how can you take a long shower? That's not something that you can do. This is something that's literally drilled into their brains from age zero. Everybody knows that you shouldn't leave faucets on in Israel. Water conservation has been part of their elementary school education for generations. And actually in the 80s, Israel was the first country that developed and mandated the dual flushing toilets. You know, those toilets that have the two seats where, if you go number one, it's one flush, and if you go number two, it's a bigger flush. So those were mandated in Israel in the 80s. So that's very thinking forward, much more than we have here in the States. And it's because of the lack of natural resources. Israel has always been a water insecure country. It's a struggle that they've had to overcome since day zero. And it's also this idea, as we know, Israel is a Jewish country, and it's kind of juxtaposing these ideologies, Zionist ideologies, Jewish ideologies, where water conservation, the idea of environmentalism, it's something that's really part of the Israeli identity, and it's so important to Judaism as well, which is why you guys are having this fantastic social justice project at the synagogue. I'm really amazed that that's happening at your shul, and really kol hakavod. That's fantastic. So just to give you guys a little bit of an idea of this Jewish guilt that is really drilled into every Israeli about not wasting water, I'm going to show you a commercial that is just one example of the types of commercials that you'll see very regularly on Israeli TV.
עוד פעם ישראל מתייבשת. זה יכול להיות אחרת. זה לא חייב להימשך לנצח. אם נמשיך לחסוך כמו שחסכנו עד עכשיו, בעוד 3 שנים, משבר המים של ישראל יסתיים. זה יקרה כי מתקני ההתפלה יגיעו לתפוקה מלאה. אבל זה יקרה רק בעוד 3 שנים. עד אז ממשיכים לחסוך, כי ישראל עדיין מתייבשת.
So that's a government commercial, and if that's not the ultimate amount of Jewish guilt, I don't know what is. So that's kind of one of the examples of the types of water conservation ideologies that every Israeli grew up to. So let's kind of zoom out. Let's start at the very beginning. How did Israel even get to this point where water has become a dire issue? Israel's focus on water infrastructure and having enough water dates back to the time of the British Mandate in the 1930s. For those of you who don't know, prior to Israel's establishment in 1948, it was governed by the British mandate, the piece of land that we now know of Israel today was under the British rule after World War I, and the land was divided up. So the British who were ruling the area, they tried to restrict, as we know, Jews trying to flee Hitler in Europe. And one of the reasons why they tried to restrict Jewish immigration to the land of Israel, obviously there was probably anti-Semitism in there as well, but one of the reasons, at least, that they said was that there wasn't enough water or food, there wasn't enough water to grow food for the amount of population there, for the influx of population that would happen. The pre-state Zionists were obviously not too happy about that, and they wanted to do everything that they could to kind of show the British that they were wrong. They did not succeed in persuading the British, but it did result in a focus on water conservation, and that's something that we see continuing until today. So this is a picture of early Israelis and during the time of the Yishuv, and this is something where they all had to come together to talk about the water scarcity. Israel had to do a lot of different things at once, right? At the beginning of Israel's establishment, and even before Israel's establishment, the country was not only defending its borders during wars, but it was absorbing a ton of immigrants from different populations all around the world. Jewish refugees were flooding the land of Israel. So they had to not only defend itself and absorb all the refugees, but they had to do so in a way that was going to build a massive national water infrastructure, because water is what was going to sustain these people. It is a major thing that was going to sustain these people, which is why in 1955, Israel made a major decision that they were going to start metering water, meaning that water could not get from point A to point B without going through a meter, and that way they could charge for the amount of water that was going to be used by each person. And it also created an important and really critical opportunity to start developing data on how water was flowing, where it was going, during what time of day, who it was going to, how it was being used. And in 1959, actually, a law was passed that made water resources public property, meaning that everything with regards to water and water resources were made available by consumers as directed by the water commissioner. And the water commissioner was responsible for implementing the government's policies. So this was something that happened as early as 1959 in Israel. Moving forward, in 1959, a very important Israeli innovation was invented. I'm sure that many of us have heard of drip irrigation. That's kind of the go-to thing that everybody talks about when everybody talks about Israeli innovation. So in 1959 is when it was officially kind of incorporated, but in the early 1930s is when it was discovered by this young water engineer. His name was Simcha Blas. And he noticed while he was growing trees, there was a row of trees, and they were all planted on the edge of the farm. And the trees were all exactly the same height, except for the one on the end of the row. And this one was about twice as tall and bushy as well than the rest of the trees. And so he walked over there and he thought that was kind of weird, because he knew that he planted the trees all the same way. And he happened to see that there was a little metal water pipe that had sprung just a little tiny leak right by that one particular tree. And it was dripping, dink, 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 just on that one specific tree, on that one specific spot. So by accident, he was actually, he invented water drip irrigation by observing that. So it took some time before people started taking that seriously. I'm sure a lot of people thought he was nuts when he first started talking about it. And it wasn't until the late 1960s that there were some people in a kibbutz called Kibbutz Hatzirim in the desert by Be'er Sheva. And they started a company called Netafim. And Netafim is the company that started establishing and manufacturing these systems. And in the 1970s, they actually started exporting them all around the world. So everywhere it goes, this Israeli technology is really able to help conserve water. It also helps to conserve on fertilizers and increase crop yields by, I think it's anywhere between 25 and 300% or something along those lines. So it's something that's used worldwide, not just in Israel, and it's able to help countries, especially where water scarcity is an issue. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. So here we see a picture where some Israeli officers are meeting with different Iranian officers, which might seem a little bit weird, but Israel's water expertise was actually noticed by other countries very early on, because Israel, as I mentioned, because it's in the Middle East, and because they have so many issues with water conservation and dealing with their water issues, they needed to figure out their water issues very quickly. So in this picture, the reason why Israel is sitting with different Iranian officers is because from 1962 until the Islamic Revolution in 1979 in Iran, Israel was actually really deeply involved in helping the water infrastructure in Iran. They saw and helped with oversight. Starting in 1962, the reason why it started in 1962 was because there was a big earthquake that destroyed a lot of the irrigation systems in Iran. And then it ended in 1979 because Khomeini severed relations with Israel. But Israel was helping with hundreds of engineers, hydrologists, geologists. Many were helping in Iran in order to make sure that the Iranians were getting the water that they needed in order to help build their water infrastructure. And not just in Iran, but actually Israel has helped China a lot with their water infrastructure. The opposite happened in China, where at first China had an agreement with the rest of the Islamic Conference in the United Nations to boycott Israel. That lasted until the 1980s, when the Chinese government realized that Israel actually had the answers for a lot of the water issues that they were having. So they started to change their ideologies. And around then, that's when teams of Israeli hydrologists were brought to China. And it was all done secretly, of course. But they helped to kind of diagnose the issues of what was going on with the water issues in China. And this is a really hopeful story, and one that it might be repeated by many other countries, where people are noticing the expertise that Israel has with regards to water, and will hopefully help with water diplomacy. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we move forward. So this is something I think that we have all heard about when it comes to water conservation in Israel, is the desalination plants. Desalination was first developed in Israel in 1965. The company that developed it is called Mikorot. It's not a company, it's Israel's national water utility. And it established the first seawater desalination facility in an effort actually to help Eilat at first, because Eilat is missing fresh water. It's on a sea, but that's salt water. It can't be used for drinking. So that was why it was initially started. But it started off as a very energy intensive unit. So they were looking for alternatives to make it more efficient and to make it cheaper. And they actually found an American technology called reverse osmosis. For those of you who don't know what reverse osmosis is, it's a way to kind of use, it pushes seawater through membranes. And it was discovered that salt and minerals could be separated by using that membrane, and the salt and the minerals would stay on one side, and the fresh water would go on the other side. It was actually developed by an American Jew named Sidney Loeb, born in Kansas and studied for his PhD at UCLA. And I'm not just saying that because I went to UCLA, but that is the history of reverse osmosis. So getting back to desalination. After Israel faced an energy crisis in the 1970s, Israel actually, or Mikorot, the Israeli water plant, established 15 desalination plants that supplied the water to the Israelis living in the Negev desert, which, as we know, does not have a lot of water, and it's difficult to get water to the Negev desert. And that increased the demand for fresh water in those areas, and led to much of Israel's population benefiting from that technology. Israel continues until today to use desalination. It produces the equivalent of about 85% of its household drinking water using desalination. And it's become quite cost efficient. What are the numbers here? Let me look. Israeli households pay about $30 a month for their water. If you compare that to different American households, in Las Vegas, people pay about $47 a month, and in LA, people pay about $58 a month. So in Israel, it is quite cost effective to be using desalination. In addition to that, actually, we're going to skip through this. we're going to skip to water recycling. That's more interesting. Water recycling is another step that Israel took in order to make sure that they were using water effectively. In 1952 is when Israel made the decision that water was too valuable to not use twice, essentially. So what they were doing is they were capturing the water sewage, the country's sewage, and capturing it and treating it. At first, it was mainly built for farms because it wasn't pure enough to drink. But the big breakthrough came in the 1970s when Tel Aviv actually experimented with pumping all of their city's wastewater into sand dunes. And the sand, they hoped, would act as a natural filter. And now it's used in that type of water is used in agriculture. It's a process that took about 6 months to a year in order to purify that water. But what came out of the other end was nearly fresh water, usable for anything but drinking. And by the 1990s, Israel actually built a huge amount of treatment facilities capable of treating and storing and delivering that water, that kind of cleaned out filtered water, from the sewage of the population to every municipality in the country. And today, 85% of that sewage gets reused for agriculture. 10% is used to increase the river flow and to help fight forest fires. And only 5% of Israel's wastewater is released into the sea. So as you can see, Israel's water is being used very efficiently, and very little of it is actually being pumped into the ocean as waste. Farming is also something that is very important in Israel. There's a vast amount of farms. And because of the lack of water, the Israeli innovators needed to develop seeds in farming that were drought resistant, just in case there was a year where there was particularly not a high amount of rainfall. Another reason was because as the Arab-Israeli conflict escalated, there was a decision by different Palestinian farmers to actually boycott Jewish farmers and refusing to sell them seeds. So Jewish farmers banded together and they began to think about how they could get around this boycott, how they could get around these issues. And they developed a cooperative called Hatzera. And by 1959, they were actually exporting a surplus of these drought-resistant seeds to countries who had climates similar to Israel's with a lack of water. Today in Israel, there's actually, because of this work that Hatzera started in 1959, Israel is actually a seed breeding giant, and it competes in world markets with water efficient crops. So they are not only developing and growing water efficient crops, but they are exporting them as well to countries in Africa, as you could probably guess, and helping them with their farming, making it much more water efficient as well. Other interesting water technologies we'll go through very quickly. In the past 10 years, there's been more than 200 startups in Israel that have focused on water technology. It's obviously a very important matter in Israel, and everybody's trying to make it even more efficient. I think one of the most impressive technologies in Israel is called Hagichon, and it's in Jerusalem, and it's so cool. I'm going to explain to you how it works. Every day there's sensors in the pipelines in Jerusalem that record the sound of the water rushing through these pipelines in 10-second increments. These recordings are then transmitted into computer systems that do the translating, and they analyze the sounds of rushing water, and it turns out that flowing water in a pipe sounds differently when there's a leak and when there's not a leak. And there is a GPS guided robots that also crawl through the sewage systems that look for leaks. It's really cool. The technology is so sensitive that they can actually catch a shower that's left on in someone's home, and they can pinpoint exactly where that is and figure out if something's wrong. Because of this system, Jerusalem's overall water loss is down to, what's the number? 11%. And there's more developed neighborhoods that are down to as low as 6%. Just so that we have some comparison, most European countries are at around 20 to 40%. So as you can see, Israel is definitely a leader when it comes to saving water using these different technologies. So here's the question that everybody's always asking about: what does the Israeli-Palestinian water cooperation look like? As I already mentioned, Israel doesn't just keep its water technologies for itself, but it actually shares it with people all around the world to help them overcome their water scarcity as well, and that includes the Palestinians, even amidst the conflict. The Palestinians' consumption of fresh water in the West Bank grew really dramatically between 1967 and 2010. And Israel helped to put in because Israel helped them to put in modern water systems that increase their demand for fresh water. Israel since then has been giving its own water to the Palestinians, and it's actually over the amount that was originally agreed upon in the Oslo Accords, which was an international treaty signed in 1993. And part of it was how the Israelis and the Palestinians were going to cooperate using water. And so that's the West Bank. Israel also continues to pump water into Gaza every year, as agreed upon also in the Oslo Accords. And unfortunately, there's a lot of water mismanagement in Gaza because of their government system of Hamas, but that's a whole nother conversation that we can have at a different time. The issue is less severe in the West Bank, but some Palestinians are also facing water shortages because of the mismanagement of the water system by the Palestinian Authority as well. But it is something that Israel continues to help out and pump water into the West Bank and into the Gaza Strip. Water has been the basis for cooperation. This is where we're going to get to the point on water diplomacy. It's been a basis for cooperation all around the world. In 2017, the United States actually mediated an agreement between the Israelis, the Palestinians, and the Jordanians to build desalination plants along the Red Sea, which would be used to replenish the Dead Sea and also create fresh water, which would be delivered among all the three parties, the Israelis, the Palestinians, and the Jordanians. So who knows, maybe soon the Israelis, Palestinians, and Jordanians will all be drinking from the same water source. Let's see if that happens. And then to kind of bring America into the picture as well, Israel has helped many cities around the country, around the country with their water issues as well. I'm gonna just name a few that are of interest, but I'm sure there are plenty more to be talking about. Israel has a cooperation with Akron, Ohio in 2012 is when they signed that deal. And the Israeli companies there are working with the city in order to bring the company's water monitoring and conservation methods, Israel's water monitoring and conservation methods to Akron. In Massachusetts, this is actually kind of cool. In Massachusetts, the state recently held a major contest for innovative water technology, which actually brought 32 Israeli top water tech companies to compete against each other for a bunch of different prizes, including one included a trip to Massachusetts and meeting with the other top industry officials. So the winner was called TAC Account, TACOUNT. And it was they developed a technology that detects and counts the microorganisms in food and water in a matter of minutes instead of days. And that's usually what it was beforehand. So that was a cool little thing that Israel did with Massachusetts. And then in Illinois, the University of Ben Gurion in the Negev in Beersheba and the University of Chicago actually signed a water research agreement. The project would examine and develop actually solutions for everything associated with improving water quality. And it could target surface water, below surface water, groundwater, streams, ponds, rivers, and lakes. So they were going to be working on different water cooperation methods. And of course, there is no state that needs more help with its water than California, where I came from before I moved to New York. It's super urgent for California. California is always in a drought, it feels like. In 2004, Netanyahu and the governor of California, Jerry Brown, signed a technology sharing agreement, which would help the United States and Israel with different funding for both California and Israel. in 2015, there was a partnership launched actually with Google for Israeli technology and innovations to help ease water concerns and do a better job conserving California water resources. LA and Beverly Hills have a task force with joint projects to help manage the water crisis. And Israel and California have been working together before all of this started to study how recycling wastewater for agriculture and desalination might be a good source for California. As you know, a lot of the agriculture in the United States does come from California, which does not make sense because California does not have water. So a lot of these desalination plants are being built in California as well to help use that water for agriculture. And then Israel's also just been helping with advising different water management policies to help kind of make water less expensive, more efficient, and help incentivize farmers to actually adopt drip irrigation, as well as a bunch of other good management practices. So that's what Israel is doing to help the state of California. We are going to watch this short video now to kind of sum it all up.
With clean water a growing scarcity worldwide, Israeli water purification company Neurosoft Water Industries is rapidly taking center stage. The Carmiel-based company has developed low-cost, mobile desalination units that can be used with virtually any source of water, from seawater to brackish groundwater. Since it was founded in 2001, the company has been called on to provide life-saving drinking water to victims of the 2004 tsunami in the Maldives, to people living in refugee camps in Kosovo and Albania, and even to scientists in Antarctica. Get the full story at Israel21c.org.
So there's just so many different water technologies that are being used around the world in order to help. I think one of the coolest ones that I saw recently is there is now a machine that Israelis have developed which actually can take the water, the moisture that exists in air, and purify it, filter it, and actually have it come out into a cup that you can drink. It's drinkable water. And so this is particularly good for areas that have a lot of moisture in the air and have water scarcity. Oops. So just to kind of tie everything up together, we are talking about how Israel is using a lot of their water technologies and sharing it with different places around the world. Israel trades its water technologies with actually over 150 countries around the world, which is particularly interesting because Israel doesn't actually have diplomatic relations with some of them, but they're still sharing their water technologies. Israel has shared water technologies with India, helping them with different desalination projects. They're also helping different countries in Africa, such as Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, to help them with water, agriculture, and then soil conservation technologies as well. Israel is also helping different African countries provide free water treatment for more than the past 20 years. Israeli officials have gone to Switzerland to help in cooperation combating their droughts. And in 2015, actually, Israel joined the World Bank Group Water Global Practice. And they're helping to develop countries overcome more complex water issues. So this is just an example of, or a couple of examples of what Israel is doing to help the rest of the world. So what can we expect looking into the future? In 2017, the Sea of Galilee, which is the lake near the border with Syria in northern Israel, it fell to its lowest water level in the last 100 years. We now know that the Sea of Galilee, because of the intense amount of rain, but also because of the conservation policies that are in place, the Sea of Galilee is actually the highest that it has ever been in the past decade right now. Syria and Jordan actually depend on some of the same water sources in Israel, which has added to tensions in the past. And then there's also the issues that we spoke about with the Palestinian consumption of water and their need in cooperation with Israel as well. Some other serious challenges that we see moving forward, which can actually be opportunities, is all of these different issues that Israel has with regards to water, because it's going to challenge them to be much more sustainable and then also use that in cooperation. And with regards to the conflict, there's also an opportunity for cooperation in reviving the Dead Sea and helping to solve the Gaza water crisis and other water shortages that exist in the area. So this is a very brief overview, but also very in-depth overview that I challenge you, and I hope that you can all take the time to learn more about how Israel has been using its time to overcome the challenge of water scarcity in the Middle East, and not only using that for themselves, but using it in order to help others. So I hope that you learned something new today. Thank you so much for taking the time, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you guys have at this point.
Thank you, Mary.
Go ahead, Rabbi. There are a few questions in the Q&A if you'd like to look at those. Thank you so much for this informative presentation. Can you see the Q&A?
Yes, I can see
Okay.
them. Rabbi, do you want to go through them, or do you want me to just take
Sure,
them?
I'm happy to, thank you.
Fantastic.
So just on your last point about the Dead Sea, I know that when traveling to Israel, that's one of the saddest places right now to go visit, where people have to like kind of now take shuttle buses to the Dead Sea. You said that there are some strategies that are starting to happen to help preserve the Dead Sea. Can you explain a couple more of those?
Yeah, absolutely. So in addition to one of the major reasons why the Dead Sea is losing its size is because of all the minerals that are being pulled from the Dead Sea. And then in addition, the tourism and whatnot. It's actually interesting. We're actually about to have a webinar on our Stand With Us Connect web series, which is a web series that we put in place because of COVID, where we are having an expert come and speak specifically about this next week. So I didn't plug this question, I promise, but there is going to be someone who is much more knowledgeable than I speaking about that. But some of the things that they are putting into place are different policies that have to do with kind of what can be taken and when it can be taken. And then also, along the lines of water conservation, there, you know, the Dead Sea is connected to the Kinneret, to the Sea of Galilee in northern Israel. So if we're able to figure out a way to either pump more water into the Dead Sea, or conserving the water that comes from the Kinneret and comes down the Jordan River to the Dead Sea, that's another way that they are working to try to make the Dead Sea much more full. But then, as you or if you remember, as I mentioned earlier, some of the water sewage treatment that Israel is using is not only used for agriculture, but also used to pump into different water systems in order to help replenish those bodies of water. So those are just different examples of what Israel's doing in order to replenish that.
So a couple of the questions that have come in the question and answer box. About the drip irrigation, someone wanted to know a little bit about certain crops that are more water efficient. Are there that has...
That's a fantastic question. I don't know the answer to that, unfortunately, but I do know that drip irrigation, what I can tell you is that drip irrigation is something that is used not only in Israel anymore. We actually use it in many places here in the States. And it's something that it's perfectly timed droplets of water that leak onto the seeds and then also the plants to help them grow. Don't quote me on this, but I'm pretty sure I'm right, that drip irrigation is able to help any sort of plant. It's really a way to make sure that we are not overwatering plants, we're not underwatering plants, but we're using water in the most efficient way possible for the maximal amount of growth.
Someone was interested in the, are there issues with toxins that produce from the sewage? So you highlighted a little bit about the
Right, exactly. So because of those issues, the sewage water that exists in Israel is used primarily for agriculture. And then another thing that they use it for is replenishing different water sources, but then also putting out forest fires. So that water is not necessarily being used to drink, but it is being used for other things that require massive amounts of water in Israel.
And a couple of questions about desalination plants. So one of them is about commenting on the jointly build with China on the desalination plant in Israel. And another one was the desalination enterprise in the Red Sea. Will that come true? I don't know if you know about those.
Yeah, there's a bunch of different really, really, really big desalination plants that are in Israel. And whether or not these ones actually come into the, listen, I remain optimistic. That's kind of, what is it that Ben Gurion said? If you're not a an optimist. You're not in order to be a Zionist, you have to be an optimist or something along those lines. You know, there's a reason why Israel's national anthem is called Hatikva. It's because everybody there has hope. So listen, what's the number one reason, I think, that Israel is such an innovative country is tell an Israeli they can't do something and they will prove you wrong. They will do it, you know, that's the Israeli chutzpah for you, is they will tell you that they can do it and then they can do it better than anybody else. And so that is one of the major reasons for Israeli innovation is everybody is trying to really solve the issues that exist in the land and not taking no for an answer. How else could they make the desert bloom? So desalination has become something in the center of everybody's minds when it comes to water conservation and water use in Israel. That I think is the future of Israeli water use, because other than that, they have a lot of salt water, and that's where it's going to come from.
There is some controversy, and this is a question a little bit in the question and answer box about desalination, that it's trading fossil fuels for water. Since it's so energy intensive. So while it's good to get the water, but is it, how do you address people that might say that?
Absolutely. A lot of these systems that I spoke about originally, they did start off very energy rich. You know, they required a lot of energy. And so as you said, fossil fuels are required to use them. But then as we found technologies such as reverse osmosis and things along those lines that were much cheaper, but also much more energy efficient, you know, as time moves on, we're seeing it on a day-to-day basis of different technologies that are just being improved and made more efficient and more green in order to get the same results. Again, I'm going to come back to the same answer of tell an Israeli they can't do it and they'll figure out a way.
A couple other questions we have about possible, does Israel import water? This person's asking about bottled water from like the US or elsewhere. Are they all?
Don't believe so. If you go to Israel, there's kind of, depending on where you are in the country, the type of water, bottled water that you can buy is from a different company. So I have never seen bottled water in Israel that is from anywhere outside of Israel. There's the Mei Eden, there's the En Gedi water, there's the, you know, whatever. So I don't believe that they import bottles.
A question about how water is distributed to hospitals and for what purposes? Not sure.
I don't really understand. Yeah, I mean, hospitals get water.
Right. We have add a little bit more to that question. We're happy to answer that as well.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
So just if you, we have a couple more minutes, so if you have any other questions, question about this presentation, it will be on our website like all of our other live streams events. So if you want to rewatch it or send it to a friend that unfortunately was unable to join us, you can always get that on our website. And I know that Miri would be happy to connect with you.
Absolutely.
On there as well.
Yeah, I'm happy to speak with anybody. In addition to this shameless plug, in COVID times, everybody is having these fantastic webinars. Stand With Us shifted very quickly to moving everything digitally as soon as COVID hit, both for our students and for all of our community members. And many of those, or all of those webinars actually can be found at standwithus.com/connect. We have webinars for adults, we have webinars for college students, for high school students, even elementary school students and children. Also with the age appropriate information for each group. And if the webinar already happened, you can just click on see past webinars and you can watch it there. The content there is really, really fantastic. And as I mentioned, I believe next week, but it might be in 2 weeks, we're having a webinar specifically about the Dead Sea and conservation with water in the Dead Sea and actually replenishing the water in the Dead Sea by a tech company, an Israeli high-tech company that is working specifically on that. So that should be super interesting.
Another question came in the chat box about, do home showers have monitors to restrict how much water is used?
So it's not restricted, but you pay for the amount of water that you use. So because of the meters that are in place in Israel. Israel also in many of the homes has water heaters that exist on everybody's roofs. And the water heaters don't hold that much water. So as anybody who's been in Israel and has tried to take a long hot shower while not being in a fancy hotel has realized very quickly that if the Jewish guilt didn't get to you for taking a short shower, then the cold water will. So you pay for the water that you use, and your mother does not want you to use that much of it.
Question, does Israel work with the Gates Foundation around water?
I believe so, but I need to double check.
Yeah, I'm reflecting on one of my first trips to Israel when I was younger, and it was the first time I saw that toilet with the 1 and the 2 flushes. And the first commercial that you showed of it being dried up, that was always impressed in my mind about that Israel has a water issue, but how they've been able to be really on the cutting edge of water conservation. And I think it teaches us a lot in our communities. We take water for granted a lot, especially in New Jersey, right? If we lived in California where my brother lives, like they talk about water a lot. We don't, but I think it's a really important conversation that we need to have. And we can learn a lot from Israel about this as well. So thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I mean, to this day, it's being in California and then coming to New York, anytime I see someone leave a faucet on it physically kills me. Or those fire hydrants that people like to take off the thing and they start spraying water and playing in the fire. I can't handle it. So help everybody make sure that they are saving water. Turn off the water while you're brushing your teeth. You can, only use the amount of water that you need while washing dishes. Buy water efficient technologies. It's very important.
We've had a couple other comments just saying that there's 3 generations of the Rose family watching this webinar, and so that's given them a great focus for discussion on water conservation.
Yay.
Homes. Yeah, I saw 3 names of Stephen Rose, so they're in different locations, which well, and I guess right, you touched upon the political aspect of water, and unfortunately, water has become politicized. Right, if it shouldn't be, right? It's perhaps God-given, right? And it's a natural resource, and so if we are tending the world, but it has become an issue between Israel and the Palestinians. And so this question just came up, and maybe you've answered a little bit, but if you want to just touch base a little bit more about it, how does water impact Israel's relationship with the Palestinians?
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that Israel anticipated ahead of time when they were putting together the Oslo Accords as part of the peace process in the Oslo Accords in 93 or in the early 90s. So it's something that was anticipated, and they knew that it was something that they were going to have to work on, not only because of the location in which they live, but just because of how the framework of, how the West Bank is set up, how Gaza is set up, and whatnot. There were specific parameters that were put into place by the Oslo Accords of how much water Israel was required to provide the Palestinians living in the West Bank and Gaza, what those parameters looked like, when that was supposed to happen, how the different governments were supposed to cooperate in order to make sure that those did happen. And to this day, actually, maybe even to Israel's detriment, they provide more water to the West Bank and to the Gaza Strip than what was originally agreed upon in the Oslo Accords. And unfortunately, as we know, the government systems in the West Bank and in Gaza are not the most efficient or good for their people. So a lot of that water is squandered, is not used in the most efficient way possible. And unfortunately, the people who suffer are the Palestinians themselves, who don't see the amount of water that they should be getting, the amount of clean water that they should be getting, or the amount of efficient water use that they should be getting. And so I truly hope for a day where there will be a government system in place, both in the West Bank and in Gaza, that will benefit the Palestinian people, not only for the sake of water, but for the sake of everything in general, so that they can, live a happy and free life. That's something that I do look forward to into the future. Water is one of the main issues, and wars have been fought over water for millennia. So it will continue to be an issue that comes up between the Israelis and the Palestinians. It will continue to be talked about, but it is very important to keep in mind that Israel does provide the Palestinians with the amount of water that is necessary, and I hope that they get it.
Yeah. Elaine, do you want to wrap us up?
So this has been so informative for us, and because we've recorded it, more people from the temple will get to see it.
Great.
But thank you for all the great work that Stand With Us does on many different fronts, and hopefully you'll be able to keep in touch with us so that we can join your other webinars and your other presentations. But thank you so much for joining us on a Sunday night
My
and
pleasure.
sharing with us all the great things that Israel is doing with water.
Thank you guys for being such a fantastic temple. This is great. I love being part of this.
Thank you so much. Have a good night, everyone.
Laila Tov.
Laila Tov.
Save water.
Bye.
Good night.
Good night.
Night.